I'd like to talk to you about community, about relationships, and about overcoming adversity. I'd like you to think for a moment about your most meaningful relationships. Perhaps it's with your parents or your siblings. Maybe it's your partner or your children. There's one thing all of these relationships have in common, and that's the more you put into them, the more you get out. I've come to discover that community can be a very powerful relationship. My sense of community has almost always been tied to my camera. I grew up poor, so we didn't have a camera, and there are very few photographs from my own childhood. I think it's from this scarcity that my love of photography was born. I lost my parents at a young age, and I moved from one foster home, one school, one caregiver to the next. And this could leave me feeling very alone, very isolated. I think there are times in all of our lives when we can feel disconnected from one another. And it's easy to overlook the power of community. Eventually, I took my camera and I came to study at NSCC. And that was my first real sense of community. We were a small school. We were a very tight-knit group. And we spent all day together, every day, pursuing our dreams. Turns out my dream at the time was to work for the Chronicle Herald. There was one major problem. The photo editor at the time didn't believe in hiring women. So my colleagues rallied around me, and together we broke the gender barrier. And I became the first female press photographer to ever work in Nova Scotia. It was made possible by the power of community. Eventually, I took my camera all the way across the country and on to Asia. Honestly, I went to Asia just in search of great photographs. But what I accomplished there was so much more. I ended up volunteering in a refugee camp in Thailand. And for the first time in my life, the roles were reversed, and I became the caregiver. My students were war refugees, and they had lost everything: possessions, family, country, community. It became my job to help them build that back up, and I did the best I could. For instance, they were being resettled to the US, and I taught them not to eat their neighbor's dog. That's not okay. I taught them not to cook fires in the middle of their living room because they could burn the whole house down. I was pretty valuable. Eventually, I returned to Canada with a souvenir, and I married him. And after traveling around a bit, we ended up on the West Coast. And I lived there for 10 years, and I'm not going to lie, I still miss the West Coast. I miss the mountains, I miss the lifestyle. It'll always be in my heart. But I'm a maritimer, and there's like a rubber band right in the middle of my back. And every time I get too far from home for too long, it snaps and it pulls me back. So at the turn of the century, I was back where I started, starting over. Sorry, I'm not paying attention to the slides. In an attempt to model volunteering for my own children, I decided that I was going to do a calendar to raise funds for the local children's hospital. So I marched into the IWK and I said, "This is what I'm going to do." And they said, "No, we're not hiring a photographer." I said, "No, I'm not looking to be hired." "No, we're not going to spend the money to produce this calendar." I said, "Okay, I'll pay for it." They actually said, "No, we can't even endorse this. You can't use our logo." They thought I was crazy. They may have been right. So I went ahead, I produced the calendar anyway, and I pretty much sold this thing door to door the first year. I would drop them off 10 at a time to doctors and dentist offices, to schools, to camera stores, and then I would run around like crazy and I would restock the calendars and I would collect the money. And at the end of a few months, I actually raised almost $5,000, and I walked in and I gave them a check. In the ensuing 8 years, I produced 4 more calendars that raised almost $50,000. And to this day, that relationship is one of my most enduring professional relationships. But it wasn't handed to me. I worked very, very hard to foster that relationship. I had to prove myself. I had to make that happen. And I think with a lot of relationships, the same thing is true. You really have to make them happen. So I made my relationship with the IWK happen, and as much as I'm proud of this work, I honestly think I'm more widely known for this work. Because one day the firefighters called. Now that's a tight-knit community. And these guys, they don't just look good, they do good. In 4 years, we raised tens of thousands of dollars for the Burn Treatment Society. This little tangent was just some visual candy. As much fun as that was, it had always been my dream to do a project on homelessness. But if you just run out into the street and start randomly photographing homeless people, it kind of makes you insensitive, it makes you kind of exploitive, and it makes you kind of a jerk. So I didn't do it, but one day Shelter Nova Scotia called, and they wanted to do an awareness campaign. And they asked if I would do a few portraits. And what should have been about a month-long project turned into a year-long obsession. I hung out at every homeless shelter, soup kitchen, drop-in center. I got to know these people. I got to hear their stories. I got to understand who they were, and it was incredibly transformative. Because the project went on so long, that was my fault. The campaign turned out to be much larger than any of us anticipated. We ended up having 100 bus ads. We had massive displays in all 3 ferry terminals, and we ended up with this beautiful collection that was on display at Alderney Landing. It was 30 very expensive 30 by 30 prints. And about halfway through the show, somebody walked into Alderney Landing and walked out with the entire collection, like everything. So that could have been a devastating loss, but what happened is every single news outlet in the land picked up the story. Remember, this was an awareness campaign. We got far more media attention for the lost prints than we did for the original show. So again, it's just really illustrated to me the power of community. I'd like to read you a letter before I finish today. And I wrote this letter about 2 or 3 weeks ago when I returned home from a trip to Toronto. And the story has a happy ending, so bear with me. The letter is called Facing My Fears. We all have a worst fear. Heights, spiders. Mine is public embarrassment. It regulates my behavior, and it keeps me in check. I come from very humble beginnings, and as a child, I was painfully aware of not fitting in. I can remember feeling excluded because I couldn't afford the price of admission, neither financial nor social. Losing my parents at a young age, followed by years of being bounced from one foster home to the next, has left a mark on me that will never completely fade. It has been the fuel to my drive, motivating me to become something greater than my upbringing. First, I became a mother of 2 children who are entering adulthood equipped with the tools that I never had. Second, I became a photographer. Photography is my identity, admission to the very circles that used to be out of reach. I now have a courtside seat to every top-shelf social and public engagement in my community. After 30 straight years of success, I became emboldened. I decided I was finally good enough. Going through what can only be described now as a midlife crisis, I took the plunge and I started a new business. If you're reading this or hearing it today, you're probably aware of my latest project. Iris Booth has propelled me to grow and learn more than I could ever imagine. With the full support of my beloved city, it started with nothing more than an idea, and it culminated with an appearance on a popular Canadian television program. With the full support of my beloved city, I trucked my booth and my team to Toronto to strut my stuff on the big stage. And that's when I faced my fears head on. I don't know why, but I never imagined the experience would go so badly. I'd watched the show and I knew they could be cruel, but I was convinced they would see the value in my venture. I couldn't have been more wrong. They destroyed me very publicly on national television. Don't get me wrong, I choked. The moment the first insult hit me like a body blow, I fell apart. And they were relentless. I stood there in front of 5 successful business leaders as a frightened 8-year-old child. They ridiculed and they laughed at me. They told me my idea was bad, my product was terrible, and I wasn't a very good business person. They told me to give up and go home. I stood there alone, with cameras watching, facing my worst fears for 30 grueling minutes. I'd like to say the trauma is over, but I cannot yet begin to heal. I wake up in panic, realizing the real nightmare begins again when the show airs. For 6 to 12 long months, I get to anticipate the humiliation of watching the entire country see my most painful moment in HD. You will get to see me tremble in fear. You will see me choke on my words. You will see them tear me to shreds, tell me to go home and quit. And then perhaps you'll see my post-pitch interview, my head hung in shame, my tail between my legs, concede that perhaps they were right. Perhaps the naysayers have been right all along. But what you won't see is what happens next. I walk out into the supportive arms of those who love me. My family and my friends all flinch as though my pain is their own. They hold me, they comfort me, and they insist that I will be okay. I cry out, what could be worse? And my daughter says, winning in there and having no one out here to share it with. Mom, you win. This is me winning. Since that terrible day, a lot of good things have happened. Within 48 hours of that horrific experience, I delivered my idea, my photo booth, to the corporate head offices of LinkedIn. In the first 3 days it was there, 100 people went through the booth and used it, and the feedback was tremendous. Right now, I'm currently redesigning the look of the booth, manufacturing 10 new units that will be placed in downtown Toronto by the end of this summer. Things are looking up, not just for Iris' booth, but for Sue Siri. So I'd like to leave you with this. In life, sometimes you get knocked down. And there will be times when it will feel better just to stay down. If you build a community around you, they will not only pick you up, they will dust you off, and they will put you on your way. Thank you.